She told a dying veteran to go die quietly. Then Stallone stood up, and the room went silent. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The waiting room of the Westwood Urgent Care Clinic was a purgatory of beige walls, fluorescent lights, and quiet, shared suffering. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and anxiety, buzzed with the low murmur of a daytime talk show playing on a corner television. People sat in worn, uncomfortable chairs, their faces masks of pained patience, each lost in their own private battle with illness or injury. In a corner, attempting to be as inconspicuous as possible, sat Sylvester Stallone. He was there for a minor, nagging shoulder injury, a souvenir from a lifetime of pushing his body to its limits. A baseball cap and sunglasses offered a thin veil of anonymity, allowing him to observe the small, sad dramas of the room unfold. The antagonist of this story was not a cackling villain, but a woman whose cruelty was born of privilege and profound self-absorption. Her name was Candace Belmont. Dressed in expensive yoga attire that had likely never seen the inside of a studio, she radiated an aura of impatient entitlement. She sighed dramatically, tapped her perfectly manicured nails on her top-of-the-line smartphone, and periodically glared at the receptionist as if her personal inconvenience was a global crisis. The fulcrum of the day's impending confrontation was an elderly man sitting across from Candace. He was thin and frail, his skin the color of old parchment. He wore a simple, clean, but well-worn flannel shirt and jeans. A persistent, dry, hacking cough racked his small frame every few minutes, a sound of deep, chronic illness. He would always cover his mouth with a worn handkerchief, his eyes closing in a silent apology to the room for the unavoidable disruption. This was Walter Hayes, a man whose quiet dignity was a stark contrast to the loud, performative suffering of the woman across from him. The initial setup was a tableau of modern discontent. A celebrity in hiding, a queen of entitlement, and a sick old man, all trapped together in the slow-moving river of institutional healthcare, a storm of conflict gathering just beneath the placid surface. The shift from quiet, individual misery to a focused, ugly confrontation began with the sound of Walter Hayes's cough. It was another small, rattling spasm, one he tried to muffle in his handkerchief, but it was enough to finally shatter Candace Belmont's fragile composure. She looked up from her phone, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't speak to him directly. Instead, she performed for the room, her voice aloud, carrying whisper directed at the woman sitting next to her. "Can you believe this?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's like a plague ward in here. Some people have absolutely no consideration." Walter Hayes flinched, his watery blue eyes clouding over with a look of deep, personal hurt. He tried to sink lower into his chair, to make himself smaller, to somehow disappear. The woman Candace had spoken to just shifted uncomfortably, offering a weak, non-committal shrug, wanting no part of the impending conflict. But Candace was just getting started. This was the inciting incident, the moment her private irritation became a public performance of cruelty. Sylvester Stallone, who had been reading a magazine, slowly lowered it. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of casual, public shaming before, and it always stirred a cold, deep anger within him. He watched Candace, a predator who had found her prey, and he watched Walter, the gentle soul who was her undeserving target. The atmosphere in the waiting room, already tense, grew heavy with a new, toxic charge. The other patients, who had been lost in their own worlds, were now an unwilling audience, their eyes flicking between the aggressor and her victim. The low hum of the television could no longer mask the rising tension. The beige, sterile room was about to become a courtroom, and a verdict on human decency was about to be rendered. The escalation was as swift as it was merciless. Walter Hayes, in an attempt to be less disruptive, tried to stand and get a drink of water from the cooler in the corner, hoping to soothe his throat. The simple act of rising seemed to take a monumental effort, and it brought on another, more violent fit of coughing. It was a deep, racking sound that echoed in the quiet room, a sound of profound physical distress. For Candace Belmont, this was not a sign of suffering to be pitied, but a personal assault to be punished. She stood up, her hands on her hips, her face twisted in a sneer of pure contempt. "Oh, for God's sake," she exclaimed, her voice shrill and piercing. "Are you trying to give us all lung cancer? If you're that sick, you should be in a hospital, not spreading your germs all over the place." The direct, public attack stunned the room into a deeper silence. Walter froze mid-step, his hand on the back of a chair to steady himself, his shoulders slumped in humiliation. He looked at her, his expression one of profound, wounded confusion, as if he couldn't comprehend such targeted venom. "Ma'am," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy after the coughing fit. "I'm sorry. I can't help it." Candace took a step toward him, a predator closing in. "You can't help it? You can't help being a public nuisance? You know, there are people here who are actually trying to stay healthy." She was probing, pushing, framing his illness as a moral failing, a lack of consideration for her own pristine well-being. The tension in the room was now a physical presence. A young mother pulled her child closer to her. An elderly woman looked down at her hands, her face flushed with vicarious shame. Stallone had seen enough. He folded his magazine with a crisp, deliberate motion and placed it on the chair beside him. His movements were slow, controlled, but they carried the weight of a gathering storm. The quiet observer was preparing to step into the fray. The aggression reached a horrifying, unthinkable peak. Walter, trying to de-escalate, to retreat, turned to shuffle away from Candace, intending to go back to his seat. "I'll just sit down," he whispered, more to himself than to her. But as he turned, another cough, this one weaker but still persistent, escaped his lips. This was the final trigger for Candace Belmont's rage. The last shred of her civility, her humanity, vanished. She looked at this frail, sick old man, and in a voice that was shockingly clear, cold, and devoid of any emotion, she said the words that would hang in the air forever. "You know what? We'd all be better off if you would just go die quietly somewhere." A collective, audible gasp swept through the waiting room. It was a sound of pure, unified horror. The receptionist's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The other patients stared, mouths agape, at Candace, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. It was a statement of such profound, monstrous cruelty that it seemed to break a fundamental law of human interaction. Walter Hayes stopped dead. He swayed on his feet, his face a mask of utter devastation. The insult was not just an attack on his illness. It was an attack on his very right to exist. It was a death sentence delivered in a waiting room. This was the moment that Sylvester Stallone stood up. He rose to his full height, not with anger, but with an immense gravitational calm that seemed to pull all the focus, all the air in the room toward him. He took off his sunglasses, and his eyes, which were not angry but filled with a deep, chilling coldness, settled on Candace Belmont. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was a low, steady, and terrifyingly controlled rumble. What did you just say to him? It was not a question. It was a demand for her to repeat her sin, to own the poison she had just spewed into the world. It was the beginning of her public reckoning. The breaking point was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, chilling moment of confrontation that brought the world of the waiting room to a dead stop. Candace Belmont, caught in the unblinking, ice-cold stare of Sylvester Stallone, faltered. The recognition of who he was, combined with the sheer, unexpected force of his quiet fury, shattered her arrogant composure. I was just saying," she stammered, her voice losing all of its shrill confidence. "He's coughing all over the place. It's unsanitary." She was trying to reframe her monstrous comment as a reasonable concern for hygiene, a desperate, pathetic attempt to crawl back from the ledge she had just thrown herself over. Stallone took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He didn't rush. He moved with the patient, inexorable pace of justice. The other people in the waiting room seemed to hold their collective breath. "Unsanitary." Stallone repeated the word, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He let the word hang in the air, letting her hear its pathetic inadequacy. "That's what you were saying?" He then turned his head slightly and looked at Walter Hayes, who was still standing, frozen, a picture of wounded dignity. A flicker of something, respect, compassion, apology, passed across Stallone's face. Then he turned his full attention back to Candace, who now looked like a trapped animal. He leaned in slightly, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, a tone of such profound, concentrated contempt that it was more terrifying than any shout. "I'm going to tell you a story," he whispered. The words meant only for her, but their intensity was felt by everyone. About sanitation. About a place so unsanitary it would make you beg for the sterile, air-conditioned comfort of this room. His eyes were locked on hers, and in them, she could see a reflection of her own shriveled soul. The climax had arrived, and it was not going to be a debate. It was going to be an education, and the tuition was her public humiliation. With the entire waiting room held captive by the sheer, raw force of his presence, Sylvester Stallone began to methodically dismantle Candace Belmont's world. He had seized the moral high ground, and from that vantage point, he delivered a story that was both a tribute and a devastating condemnation. "That man you just told to go die," Stallone began, his voice still a low, intense whisper that commanded absolute silence. "His name is Walter Hayes. And 40 years ago, he was a combat medic in Vietnam." He paused, letting the title, Combat Medic, sink in, a stark contrast to Candace's world of yoga pants and selfish complaints. He wasn't worried about germs, ma'am. He was worried about shrapnel. He spent his days and nights covered in things you wouldn't let your dog touch. Blood, mud, the filth of a jungle war. He wasn't complaining about a cough. He was trying to listen for the sound of a collapsed lung through the roar of helicopter blades and machine gun fire. Stallone's eyes never left hers. He was forcing her to see the man she had just condemned, to see the life he had lived. "You're worried about your health." He spent 2 years putting his hands inside the bodies of boys not much older than his own son, trying to hold them together long enough to get them home. He breathed in Agent Orange and the smoke of burning villages, so you could have the freedom to breathe this clean, sterile air and complain about it. The condemnation was absolute. He had drawn a line between her petty, self-absorbed existence and a life of profound, unimaginable sacrifice. That cough, Stallone's voice dropped even lower, filled with a righteous, holy fury. That isn't the sound of him being inconsiderate. That is the sound of his service. It's the sound of the jungle he can't get out of his lungs. It's a medal he wears on the inside, a reminder of every life he fought to save. And you have the audacity to tell him to go die quietly. He straightened up, his whisper now a searing indictment for the entire room to hear. He has lived a life of more honor and consequence in his sickest moment than you have likely ever known in your entire, comfortable, selfish life. Having delivered his devastating moral verdict, Stallone's definitive action was not a walk-off, but a quiet, powerful act of restoration. He turned his back on the utterly shattered and humiliated Candace Belmont, dismissing her from his reality. He walked over to Walter Hayes, who was watching him with tears silently streaming down his weathered face. Stallone put a gentle, steadying hand on the old man's frail shoulder. "Walter," he said, his voice now filled with a warmth and respect that was a stark contrast to his previous cold fury. "Are you all right?" Walter could only nod, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. "Good," Stallone said. He then guided the old man back to his chair, helping him sit down with a gentleness that was profoundly moving. He then walked to the front desk, where the receptionist was staring at him, her eyes wide with awe. "Excuse me," Stallone said politely. "I'd like to pay for Mr. Hayes's visit today. All of it. Any prescriptions, any follow-ups. Put it on my card." He handed her his credit card, a simple, practical act of kindness that was more powerful than any speech. This was his withdrawal from the argument. He was no longer engaging with the antagonist. He was now actively caring for the victim, a definitive, public declaration of whose side he was on. He then turned to the rest of the waiting room, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces. "I apologize to all of you," he said, his voice calm and clear, "for having to witness that display of profound disrespect. No one, especially not a man who has served this country, should ever be spoken to that way." This final statement was not just an apology. It was a final, damning judgment on Candace's behavior, delivered to the jury of her peers. He had made his stand, he had cared for the wounded, and he had restored a measure of dignity to a room that had been poisoned by cruelty. The immediate aftermath in the Westwood Urgent Care was a study in quiet, powerful transformation. As Stallone stood by the reception desk, a silent guardian for Walter Hayes, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The other patients, who had been cowed into silence, now seemed to find their voice, not in words, but in actions. An older woman who had been knitting stood up, walked over to Walter, and gently placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. A young man in a business suit, who had been impatiently checking his watch moments before, approached the reception desk. "I'd like to contribute to his bill as well," he said to the receptionist, pulling out his wallet. The receptionist, tears in her eyes, simply shook her head and pointed to Stallone's credit card, already in her hand. "It's been taken care of," she said with a small, watery smile. Candace Belmont, who had been frozen in place, the object of 100 cold stares, finally broke. She let out a small, choked sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated shame. She grabbed her purse, and without a word, without making eye contact with anyone, she fled. She pushed open the clinic door and disappeared into the Los Angeles sunlight, a woman running from the public wreckage of her own character. Her departure was met not with jeers or comments, but with a profound, almost pitying silence. The room, cleansed of her toxic presence, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The talk show on the television droned on, unnoticed. The real drama, the real lesson, had concluded, and everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The story of the waiting room confrontation spread with the quiet, inexorable force of a rising tide. Several people had discreetly filmed the encounter, and the footage was posted online within the hour. The video was raw, emotional, and utterly compelling. It wasn't a story of a celebrity beatdown. It was a story of quiet dignity, monstrous cruelty, and a powerful, righteous defense. The hashtag Die Quietly became a global symbol of the outrage against Candace Belmont's behavior, while hashtag Stallone Defends and hashtag Walter the Hero celebrated the positive forces in the story. Candace Belmont was identified and publicly excoriated. Her social media was flooded with messages of condemnation. A prominent mommy blogger who recognized her from the LA yoga scene wrote a scathing article about the culture of entitlement that had produced such a person, an article that was shared millions of times. She became a pariah, a living meme for heartless privilege. The public fallout was a massive wave of support for Walter Hayes. His story was uncovered by a local news station. He was a decorated Vietnam veteran, a widower, living on a small pension, battling service-related lung issues. A GoFundMe was started for him by the young man from the waiting room, and it blew past its goal of $10,000 in less than an hour, eventually raising over $500,000 from donors all over the world. Veterans groups used the incident to launch a new awareness campaign about the ongoing health struggles of Vietnam veterans, particularly those exposed to Agent Orange. The incident became a national conversation about empathy, about the invisible wounds of war, and about the shocking lack of compassion that can fester in the comfortable corners of society. In the months that followed, the consequences of that one afternoon in a beige waiting room rippled outward, changing lives in profound ways. Walter Hayes, with the funds raised for him, was able to move into a comfortable assisted living facility near his daughter. He received top-of-the-line medical care that eased his suffering and extended his life. He was no longer a frail, forgotten man, but a cherished community hero, his story a testament to the fact that it's never too late for a society to say, thank you. Candace Belmont, facing overwhelming public shame, retreated from public life. The incident forced her into a long, painful period of self-reflection. Whether she ever truly learned the lesson of empathy remains unknown, but she became a permanent cautionary tale about the ugly consequences of a life lived without it. For Sylvester Stallone, the event further solidified his public persona as a man of deep character and integrity. He never spoke of it publicly, deflecting any praise and insisting the focus remain on Walter. His quiet strength and his refusal to grandstand only made the public admire him more. The ultimate lesson of the Westwood Urgent Care Clinic was a stark and powerful one. It was a reminder that the true measure of a society is not how it treats its strongest members, but how it cares for its most vulnerable. It was a lesson that courage and heroism are not confined to the battlefield. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is to simply keep breathing, to keep showing up in a world that has forgotten their sacrifice. And it was a profound illustration that sometimes the most powerful thing one human being can do for another is to simply stand up in a quiet room and declare, with every fiber of their being, that this person's life, this person's struggle matters.